Hello everyone and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Pentax P3N. Okay, the Pentax P3N is a multi-mode 35mm interchangeable lens camera. What does that mean? Multi-mode means that it has three different shooting modes: program, aperture priority, and manual. And I'll show you in video 2 how to use each of those modes, which lenses work with each of those modes, and how to interpret the viewfinder display in each of those modes so you know how to properly meter the camera in each of them. 35mm simply means it can take any 35mm film you put in it with some caveats. It can only use film cassettes that have a DX code on them. A DX code is this silver checkerboard right here, and what this does is work with some readers that we'll see later in this video inside the camera that tell the camera what film speed it is. If you are using a film which does not have a DX code on it, then it will default to 100 ISO. So if you're using something like a 25 ISO film with no DX code on it, this camera cannot use it unless you push that film to 100 ISO. And interchangeable lens simply means that you can take the lens off the camera at any time when you're not taking a photo and put another one on, and your images will be just fine. Single lens reflex means that the light passes through the lens to this mirror that's behind it. It then bounces off the mirror up to this pentaprism housing up here and out to your viewfinder eyepiece here on the back of the camera. The Pentax P3N uses a center-weighted light meter. What that means is that an area about the size of this lens cap here, maybe a hair bigger, represents the majority of the metering information, and then everything outside of that area represents a minority of the metering information. It's a good general use light meter type, or if you're going to center compose portraits or things like that, you can use your light meter in that situation as well. Shutter speeds on this camera range from 1/1000th of a second on the fast end to 1 second on the slow end, plus bulb. With bulb, what happens when you push the shutter button down, the shutter curtain opens. When you release it, the shutter curtain closes. 1/100th here is your flash sync speed. Flashes, we'll talk about this a little bit more in video 2. Some flashes will work in program mode, but if you're shooting aperture priority or full manual mode, you'll want to use 1/100th as your flash sync. Or I believe in manual mode you can use anything slower as well. Back to the viewfinder really quickly, and the viewfinder has a 0.82x magnification rate with a 92% frame coverage. Now what that means is that when you look through the viewfinder, what you see in it will be 82% of the size of what will be on the film. 92% frame coverage means that if what you imagine that what you're looking at right now is what will be on your film, then you lose about 4% on each side as well as the top and bottom of the image that will be on your film but not in your viewfinder. So that gives you a little bit of room if you accidentally held the camera slightly askew to crop your final image and have nice level horizons and verticals. The focusing screen in the camera is a fixed split prism focusing screen with light meter display, and we'll see this whole thing again in video 2, and I'll explain to you how to read the light meter in different modes as well as how to use the focusing screen. The flash sync speed, as I noted, was 1/100th of a second. Some notes on the camera: the P3N, also called the P30N, by the way. In the US, this was the P30N. In other countries, it was the P3N. This is just a P3 with some different cosmetics. I think the addition of a rubber grip here, or slight cosmetic changes, and the addition of an aperture priority mode. Previous P3 only had program mode and full manual, so this added aperture priority, which is a great thing to add. P30T is the same as this camera functionally, but it looks a little bit different. It has a plastic door on the back instead of metal, and the rubber grip is, I guess, grippier. Also, this camera can use any K-mount lens except for the KAF4 lenses that don't have an aperture ring on them, but it can use the older SMC-K lenses, what they're typically called the SMC Pentax lenses that came out with the K line of cameras. It can also use the newer Pentax FA line of lenses, which have autofocus as well as aperture control. And which lens you use is going to determine how this camera behaves in terms of what you can do for program, aperture priority, and shutter full manual modes. What I'll do in the second video is explain which lenses work with each one and show you how to select those different modes. The Pentax P3N was an entry-level camera. We know that because the film speed can only be set by DX code. There's no way to manually override the film speed. I guess you could, in theory. They did make DX code stickers, and I think still do, that you can put on your cassette to change the DX code, or you could re-spool film into a cassette of a different DX code to push and pull it. But if you take stock film straight from the cassette and put it in here, there's no way to change the film speed. There's no exposure compensation, so you literally have no control over your film's ISO and exposure compensation with this. It can only deliver images that are properly exposed unless you're shooting in manual mode. Viewfinder magnification and frame coverage are relatively low, even by late 80s standards for cameras, and that was typically used on entry-level cameras because making a pentaprism that reduced the image and also that didn't have full frame coverage was a bit less expensive than making one that did not reduce the image and that had 100% frame coverage. Also, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the second video, but some Pentax flashes on this camera can work in program mode, as long as there are some caveats. I'm not an encyclopedia to tell you exactly which all of them are, but I will give you some pointers on flash use so that you can, in program mode, use this with a proper flash sync. P3N was made by the Asahi Optical Company from 1988 until 1990. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through what everything on the camera is, and in the second video we'll talk about what everything does. There are a couple of small controls on here we'll just talk about as we go through them. But we'll begin here by looking at the top of the camera, though technically we're going to start on the front with the strap lugs. And the strap lugs have these split rings in them, and what you can do if you are missing the split rings is just put any old split ring in. They'll work just fine. This is the film rewind lever right here, and when you're ready to rewind your film, bit frustrating, there we go, it just pops right out. It also opens up the back of the camera to get inside of there. This is your power switch. This is off, this is on. If you want to use the self timer, you can push down on the top of the power switch and slide the switch all the way up, so you can then see the ST indicator there, and that will allow you to use your camera's self timer. When you use the self timer, the red light on the front of the camera will blink. It's a 10 to 12 second self timer, something like that, and at the end of the self timer time, the camera will take a photo. And if you don't push this down, you cannot get into the self timer. You have to push this down in order to access the self timer. The switch is designed so you can only switch between off and on and can't accidentally get into self timer with a properly working switch. Flash hot shoe. The X there indicates the type of flash sync you have, which is X. Any flash that has a reusable bulb on it is an X sync flash. This is your shutter speed indicator right here. Model indicator. This is your shutter dial and mode dial, because you can switch into auto mode or manually select the shutter speed. Shutter release button. Film advance lever right here. Frame count window and a little index to tell you what frame you're on. On the front of the camera we have a few things to look at. Model number. Self timer light, as we saw a few minutes ago here. This is your depth of field preview button. I'll show you how to use that in just a minute. Lens release button, lens lock pin, lens mounting index, lens mounting flange, electronic contacts for the A, F, and FA variants of the Pentax K lenses. And over here we have the memory lock button, it's called. And what this button does is, we would call it auto exposure lock today. This allows you to do auto exposure locking with your camera. We'll talk about that in the second video. And this is a cable release socket, so you can use a cable release for your camera to do long exposures or things like that, or star trails, waterfall photos, without the risk of introducing shutter shake into your into your images rather. The way that the depth of field preview button works is that when you mount a lens, no matter what you set the aperture to here, the aperture will be open in the lens. This is called open aperture metering, and with open aperture metering, the camera knows what the fastest aperture is, f1.7, because there's a little lever in here that tells it, and it knows what you have selected for your aperture because there's another little lever that tells it, and so the light meter will compensate with your shutter speed, with your light meter reading when you adjust the aperture ring. But if you want to see what your depth of field is going to look like before you take a photo, you can push down on that button and that will close the aperture so you can see your depth of field. Of course, the smaller the aperture gets, the dimmer your viewfinder will be. You cannot meter like this. Don't meter with the aperture stop down because it will throw off your meter reading when you go to take a photo. The back of the camera doesn't have too much to see, but here we have the viewfinder eyepiece. This is what you look through to frame up your images. This right here is a frame, the film type window. So when we load film in here in the second video, you'll be able to see that. Actually, you won't be able to see with the film cassette I use, but with a normal film cassette, it lines up here so that the information on the cassette is visible through the window. And then of course we have the door that we're going to open in a moment to get into the camera. The camera's bottom has a few things: serial number, Asahi Optical Company, film rewind release, tripod socket, battery chamber. I'll show you how to change the batteries in the second video. To get into the camera's back, all you've got to do is lift up on the film rewind knob there. And now we can get inside of the camera. This is the film cassette chamber where we're going to load the film in the second video. These little contacts down here are your cassette, DX code readers. And what these do is these read the cassette's silver and black checkerboard DX code so the camera knows what speed film you have. These 4 silver rails are called film guide rails. The outer 2 keep the film from moving up and down as it goes through the camera, and the inner 2 sandwich with the film pressure plate on the back of the camera, and we'll see that in just a moment, so that the film is flat and properly focused or properly aligned to receive focused light from the lens. These are your shutter curtains right here. This is your film tension sprocket. We'll see this a little bit better in the second video, but what this does is engage with the sprocket holes on the film, and when you advance the film, this spins the direction of the film take-up spool here to pull the film through the camera smoothly. It can only spin in the direction of the film take-up spool, like I'm showing you here. It cannot spin backwards unless you press the film rewind button, and now you can spin it backwards, okay? That's why this is an important button for rewinding film. We'll see that a bunch in the second video, some uses for it. This is the film take-up spool right here, and what you do is we'll show you in the second video, you set your film leader down here at the film leader placement index, and then this will take up your film. This is your this is like a multiple use gizmo right here. This little lever presses down here to put tension on put pressure on your film so that this rubberized grip will pull your film through the camera along with this sprocket here. And then these 2 rollers here, actually I guess, yeah, it's 2 rollers, rest here and here so that they put pressure on the film sprocket so that it engages well with the sprocket holes on your film. Here's the film pressure plate I told you about. Rests behind the shutter curtain to keep your film flat, and then this little gasket around the window prevents your film from being fogged by light coming in through the window in the back of the camera door. I do have some tips for using this camera. So there are a bunch of different Pentax lenses. The oldest that this can take are called the SMC lenses, and they're marked by SMC Pentax right here on the front of the lens. After that, we have what are called the Pentax M, also called SMC M lenses. What these 2 have in common is that they do not have electronic contacts on the back of them. With these, you get full manual shooting or aperture priority shooting, and we'll cover that in video 2, how to determine that. After the SMC, so the SMC Pentaxes came first, then the SMC-Ms, then the SMC-As. This is a Vivitar, but it's an SMC-A mount lens, and the only difference between this and an M lens is that it has electronic contacts on it. The electronic contacts back here, this only has 1. The Pentax lenses have more. Allow the camera to communicate aperture information to the allow the lens to communicate aperture information to the camera so that the camera can be shot in program mode. So A lenses can be shot in program mode. This is the back of an FA lens, and you can see that it has more of the electronic contacts here. So the A lenses, the SMC-F lenses, if you imagine that just says SMC-F on it, and the SMC-FA lenses can all be used with this in program as well as aperture priority mode. I know it's a little bit confusing, but the difference with this camera, it does not have an autofocus motor. So the autofocus lenses like this one and the Dash F lenses, they're good and they're fine lenses, but you only get manual focus with them. So if you want to save a few dollars on lenses, look for the SMC-A lenses. Or if you don't need aperture priority shooting, or program mode shooting rather, if you are fine with just manual mode and aperture priority, the SMC-M and the SMC-K lenses are great options. So Couple things not to do with your camera. Don't store it with the shutter ready to fire. Always trigger the shutter at the end of the day. And the reason for that is because when you arm the shutter, there's some mechanical components in here that you put under tension. And if they sit for prolonged periods under tension, you can weaken them or they can fail. And you don't want that because that'll break your camera. Don't touch the shutter curtains that we saw on the back of the camera because your finger oils can cause them to get sticky, or worst case, they're a bunch of little overlapping leaves the way that they work like this. If those leaves skip a track, then they can overlap each other and jam and ruin your camera that way. Also, don't touch the mirror behind the lens because your finger oils can tarnish it, which can affect your image focus as well as the metering in your camera. Don't leave your camera in your car. Extreme heat in the summer can damage the plastic components. It can also cause the lubricating oils in the lens and the camera body to get very thin and get to places they shouldn't be. And in the winter, those same lubricating oils can become very thick and gummy and break down and stop working. Also, extreme cold can cause damage to the plastic. Plus, cameras are always a theft target in a car. Don't store your gear in a plastic bag or box unless you have a rechargeable desiccant pack you can put into the oven when it turns color and recharge it. And that's because plastic is moisture permeable, and if moisture gets into your camera case, then you can get fungus on your lens optics or in your viewfinder here. On the lens, fungus will affect image quality, and you don't want that. Don't let your P3N get wet. Electronics and water don't get along. There's a lot of electronics in this camera. And lastly, just remember that your Pentax P3N is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video. Here's a card that will take you to the second video, and in that video we're going to talk about the complete operation and use of the Pentax P3N.